Hey, it is the Sunday before election. And once again, we come to that season in the cycle of American life where civility and human decency just kind of seem to take a vacation, And where that gap in the values that we as Americans share become more and more polarized, and how we prioritize those values becomes exposed. With each passing 4-year election cycle, thanks in part to many agenda-driven 24/7 news outlets on both sides of the fence, the way people communicate their political views has become increasingly divisive, and our willingness to engage in respectful conversation and to seek to understand how the experience of those who think differently than we might kind of just, what led them to the conclusion they come to, just kind of become virtually non-existent at this time of year. Or this time every 4 years, I should say. And thanks mostly to social media, in my opinion, and other unusual factors that we've kind of dealt with this year, this election more than any other has, that I can recall, has tested the strength and the boundaries of family relationship and long-term friendship to the breaking point. My own heart was broken a few weeks ago when I discovered that a long-time friendship between two very close friends of ours in Florida that we always try to get together with whenever we go back kind of as a group, shockingly came to an end when one of them broke it off because the other, who was well known in her neighborhood and in her community for creating really creative Halloween displays, come across an abnormally large MAGA hat, the Make America Great hat, one of the big ones, and it happened to fit on a very uniquely sized Halloween skeleton she bought, a 12-foot skeleton. So she bought it, she put it on there, she took a picture, and she put it on social media. It was just all in good fun. Well, because of the value that the other friend places in her politics, ultimately it ruined the friendship. She took offense to it, and she ended a 2-decade-long, very close friendship. I was blown away. I was just blown away. And it just seemed like this time, every 4 years, the world just kind of falls off its rocker. You ever felt that way? That's just the way I think I turned my thing off by accident. I'm back on. As I've gotten older, though, and as I've grown in my spiritual maturity, my outlook on American politics, and anywhere else for that matter, has dramatically changed. And I still have opinions, and I still have concerns about political things, but my outlook as a whole and my emotions regarding those things have kind of changed exponentially, I would say. And as I study the Scriptures and I've observed how God appears to have worked out His will in and through national affairs, there are some things that I've become much less concerned about when it comes to our own politics. And there's things when it comes to our election processes. And there's also some things that I've become more concerned about. So this morning, I just want to take a few minutes to kind of share with you some of those observations. Now, you may find yourself agreeing with some of these conclusions, and you may not agree with others, and that's okay. And like all of you, I'm a work in progress, and I'm sure there are things that maybe I haven't taken into account or considered. And that's how we learn from one another. But let me begin by where I find myself no longer concerned or as concerned about the most, and that is the outcome of the presidential election. Now, before you kind of lose it here and just get angry with me, let me explain what I mean. When I say I'm not concerned about the outcome of this or any other election as much as I used to be, I'm not saying I don't care about the policies that might come down the pipeline, or the character of the leader that is elected, or the decision that will be entrusted to those who take office. Nor am I insinuating that either your vote or my vote or ability to vote and have a voice in the matter is unimportant. In fact, on the contrary, being one of the only few nations in the vast history of humanity that have ever been given the privilege to vote, I think is the stewardship that we need to take seriously. But what I am saying is that neither my hopes for eternity nor my hope for humanity, neither my conditions for happiness or fulfillment, nor the desires of my heart are dependent on what individual gets to sit in an Oval Office or any other office and introduce policy to a temporary nation. And yes, you heard that right. We are a temporary nation. The author of Psalm 146, writes, "Don't put your confidence in powerful people. There is no salvation there. When they breathe their last, they return to the earth, and all their plans die with them. But joyful are those who have the God of Israel as their helper, whose hope is in the Lord their God." What I found is that when we let something as fleeting as politics be a driving force in determining our relationships and interactions with one another, and more importantly, affecting our witness as followers of Jesus, we become beholden to what I call a microscopic view of life. In other words, we're in politics. In other words, when we're only looking at what God is doing in the world at the moment, or as it relates to our lifetime, or maybe 2 or 3 generations ahead, and we're only thinking about it as it relates to our personal preferences or convenience, we kind of become beholden to a limited view, to a microscopic view. Having a microscopic view of politics leads us into elevating the intensity with which we promote or defend a man or a woman who is as equally flawed as we are, if not more so. It potentially increases the risk we take in alienating those who view the world differently than we might. And sadly, it decreases the likeliness that many so-called Christians will be obedient in praying for and honoring the one who sits in the position of power because they don't share our particular perspective or don't promote what we might call a Christian view of things. Over the years, and more specifically over the last decade, I've learned that if I can just have a more, what I call a macroscopic view of earthly kingdoms and nations and political scenarios, that it changes the way in which I view the people that are put in positions of power, and the way I interact with those who think differently than I do, and may I even add, give me a lot less stress. What do I mean by a macroscopic view? Well, I simply mean that I begin to see those in political power less in terms of how much control they might attempt to exercise over my life or my sense of fulfillment, and more in the instruments whom God is using as a very small part of what He's doing in the bigger picture. In other words, as much power as they may like to think they wield, in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of God's plans for the world, kings and rulers are mere pawns in His own chess game, so to speak. Ultimately, they are putty in His hand. In fact, in Proverbs 21, verse 1, Solomon himself, a king, wrote, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever He wills." So having a macroscopic view of how God works in the political realm helps us to remember the truths behind scriptures like Psalm 75, which I think every person who runs for office should read. It's a song written by Asaph, the singer and the musician. And in that song he writes this: God says, "At the time I have planned, I will bring justice against the wicked. When the earth quakes and its people live in turmoil," boy, that sounds familiar right now, doesn't it? "I am the one who keeps its foundation firm." So we need to be careful when politicians can promise the world to us. They can promise they have all the answers and all the cures for humanity. Because God says, "I am the one who keeps the foundation firm." He goes on to say, "I warn the proud, stop your boasting. I told the wicked, don't raise your fist. Don't raise your fist in defiance at the heavens or speak with such arrogance. For no one on earth, from east or west or the wilderness, should raise the defiant fist. It is God alone who judges. It is He alone who decides who will rise and who will fall." Asaph goes on to finish his portion of the song with this conclusion: "But as for me, I will always proclaim what God has done. I will sing praises to the God of Jacob." Another more familiar verse which reminds us of God's control over who presides over a nation comes from Daniel 2, verses 20 and 21, in which most of you might be familiar with, in which Daniel prayed, "Praise the name of God forever and ever, for He has all wisdom and power. He controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings." Now you might remember that Daniel prayed that prayer when he was captured by an extremely violent king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. In that era, or actually prior to that, God gave a message through the mouth of Jeremiah regarding Nebuchadnezzar to King Zedekiah of Judah, as well as the ambassadors of 5 other countries who happened to be on diplomatic visit, to go back and to relate to their respective kings. And here's what he says: "By my great power, in my outstretched arm, I have made the earth, along with the men and the animals that are on the earth. And I give it to whomever it seems right to me. Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon," and don't miss this part, "my servant. And I have given him also the beasts of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings will make him their slave." And he goes on to warn these ambassadors and this king to warn them that if they listen to their own heart or their own pride or their own political advisors over God, and they refuse to surrender and submit to Nebuchadnezzar, He would totally destroy them. Now what I find fascinating about that passage is that God called Nebuchadnezzar His servant. If you read the story of how vicious Nebuchadnezzar was in destroying Jerusalem in 2 Chronicles 36, it's heartbreaking. He annihilated children, young adults, the elderly, the physically challenged, and many others. He kidnapped and he deported many. In fact, as I read it, I kind of thought, this sounds an awful lot like a guy from the 1940s in Germany. Most famously, though, he destroyed the temple, the house of God, burning it to the ground, and yet God calls him his servant. Now, do you think the people of Israel saw it that way? Do you think King Zedekiah saw it that way? I can assure you he didn't. Unfortunately, he did not adopt God's macroscopic view of things, and he refused to submit and refused to surrender to Nebuchadnezzar's rule in spite of many chances and multiple warnings, and eventually Judah was taken into captive. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the only unusual character God used. Another king by the name of Cyrus from Persia would come along later, capture Babylon, and reverse Israel's fortunes. He, meaning Cyrus, had a completely opposite approach and completely opposite policy regarding ruling than Nebuchadnezzar did. Instead of ruling with an iron hand and deporting the Israelites again, he gave them the opportunity to go back home and rebuild and to restore and to revitalize Jerusalem. 150 years before it ever took place, in Isaiah chapter 45, God prophesied to Isaiah about him, about Cyrus, and he even reveals his name. In that passage, God calls Cyrus his anointed one. And by the way, that word for anointed is the same word we get the word Messiah from. He calls Cyrus a Messiah, not capital M Messiah, little m, but nevertheless a Messiah. And it's the word he used. And he tells Isaiah exactly how he is setting the stage to be ready for when Cyrus was born and would make his move and take over Babylon and many other nations. And he goes on to say in that passage, "And why have I called you for this work, Cyrus? Why did I call you by name when you do not even know me? It is for the sake of Jacob, my servant, Israel, my chosen one. I am the Lord and there is no other God. I have equipped you for battle, though you don't even know me." Twice he said that. "So all the world from east to west will know that there is no other God. I am the Lord and there is no other." So you see, once again, God set the stage for a national ruler, one who doesn't even follow him. Why? Because knowing what kind of person Cyrus would be, and what kind of political approach he would take, God used him to bring about his will, which had very little to do with his policies, compared to the fact that it had more to do with the long-term benefit of God's own people. Isn't it interesting that Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus had two completely opposite political policies and approaches in dealing with Israel, and both were given the power by God? And isn't it interesting that neither one of them followed God in an intimate way, and yet God called both of them his servants or messiahs. And by the way, there's another interesting thing they had in common. They both invoked the name of God whenever it was politically expedient to do so. Neither, though, held Yahweh in the highest esteem. They both worshipped a multitude of other Babylonian idols, most notably one named Marduk. Yet in his own wisdom, God used their personalities, and he used their two different political approaches to accomplish different things regarding his people to set them on the right path. So the question is, if God could go to such great length and use idol-worshiping kings with completely opposite political policies and approaches to bring about what is in the long-term best interest for the people of Israel, doesn't it stand to reason that he is way ahead of the game now and doing the same for those of us who follow him now? Doesn't that give you kind of a bit of comfort knowing that whoever gets elected in this or any other political race, more than anything, are just a pawn in God's overall big plan that we may not even see or experience? When we learn to see the political landscape from God's perspective, we can more easily accept whatever results might happen. And yes, oftentimes it makes absolutely no sense to us, especially if and when God places an insanely wicked ruler in place, in here or anywhere else. And everything in us which wants to question God. It even causes unbelievers to question God's own moral compass, if you can believe that. But in a letter written to the Church of Rome, the ruling city where Caesar sat, the Apostle Paul gave a perfect response for such times in Romans chapter 9. He said, no matter who are we, basically, is what he's asked. He asked the question, who are we? We're just mere humans. Who are we to question what God is doing? Who is the potter and who is the clay? Then he asked this rhetorical question in Romans 9:22. He says, what if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience the vessels of wrath, meaning men like Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh and maybe even Hitler, has endured with much patience those vessels of wrath that have been destined for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for his vessel of mercy, in other words, us, which he has prepared beforehand for glory. In other words, Paul believes, as I do, that whatever kind of political environment God may be leading us to or through, it will accomplish the purpose for which he has intended, and in some way beyond our comprehension will work out for the long-term advancement of his people, even if it doesn't seem personally or currently convenient. And although I don't fully comprehend how God does it, I don't think it works any different in a republic than it does in a monarchy like Babylon or Persia or Rome. If a ruler's heart is like a stream of water that he can turn in any way he wants, so are the hearts of those who are elected to office. So are the hearts of those who elect those people to office. When we take a step back from the intense political scene in front of us, and we consider that God might be doing something on a much greater scale than we can ever imagine, that we may not even experience personally because it takes place long after we're gone, then we need not to fear. We don't need to freak out. We don't need to think that God has let us down when the ones that come to power don't represent our own personal political policies or ideas or opinion. When this election is over, when policies passed that might lead us down a dark road, or even if and when America ceases to exist, God will still be on the throne and the grave will still be empty. That's all that matters. That's having a macroscopic view of politics. And that's what I mean when I say I'm not as concerned with the election result as some people might be, or at least not as much as I used to be. But let me tell you what does concern me about the political process. I'm concerned that we, as the church, by which I mean the Big C church, have once again missed and squandered an opportunity to be the church in the middle of one of the most confusing and divisive years we've endured in a long time. At all times, but especially in times of great turmoil, the church has an incredible opportunity to stand apart, to do things differently, and to conduct ourselves honorably. We have a responsibility as God's ambassadors to the world to step into the chaos and offer a better way. And sadly, I've seen way too much evidence that the church, or the people in the church, have not made much of a difference in the political process this season. I'm concerned that far too many Christians have intersected their politics with their faith in such a way that it has added fuel to the fire. It seems that we've kind of forgotten what our primary goal is, and that is to be not about to be squeezing our opinions in at every turn, but rather to connect people to Jesus. We don't do that by trying to argue them into agreement with our political opinions. I've witnessed people on both sides of the aisle claim that if Jesus were here now, he would vote their way. Really? Are you sure? Because when I see people trying to drag Jesus into political arguments in Scripture, I see something completely different. When the Jews tried to drag him into a trap regarding paying taxes using coins with Caesar's face on them, he refused to play that game. And he basically reminded them to get the priorities straight. The Pharisees often tried to pit him against the Sadducees and vice versa. And I see him pretty much telling all of them they had issues. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Zealots, they all ended up hating him for one reason or another. When I read the New Testament, I don't see a Jesus who was interested in taking sides. I see a Jesus who is only interested in taking over. I've seen on multiple occasions people put on social media that people can't vote one way or the other and still call themselves Christians. Unbelievable. I'm actually embarrassed by that. You remember in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus said, "Blessed are the dividers"? Or when he prayed to the Father in John 17 regarding those who would follow him in the generation to come, that they would be divisive and combatant to get their message across? Me neither. Because that's exactly the opposite of what Jesus said. As I recall it, he says in Matthew 5, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called" what? The sons of God. As I recall it, he prayed that those who followed him would be one, not many. Why? So that the world around them would know that Jesus is who he said he was. Somehow I just don't think the actions and words of many who call into question the faith of those whose opinions and feelings are different for one reason or another are exactly what Jesus had in mind. When the outside world sees us saying stuff like that, they not only see us as a divisive organization, but also as a divided kingdom. And we all know what Jesus said about a divided kingdom not being able to stand. When our passions for political ideals become so intense and so passionate that we fail to consider how Jesus himself might be perceived by others in our social circles, whether it's in person or online, then we've lost sight of what's most important. We've lost sight of what our primary responsibility is. We've allowed ourselves to get dragged into a game played by the world that we will never win at on this side of heaven. You know, last year I preached a series out of 1 Peter in which I compared Peter's words in chapter 2 to a coach telling us that we need to stop playing the other team's game and start playing ours. When we get sucked into playing the world's game, including the game of politics and political opinion, it divides us and it compromises our strategy in reaching the world for Jesus. We need to remember that those who have received God's mercy and accepted his grace as shown through the cross, that we wear a different jersey now. And it's not a Republican jersey, it's not a Democrat jersey. In fact, those won't even be around in the future. How do I know? Well, how many of you here belong to the Federalist Party? Anybody here belong to the Whig Party? No? You know why? Because they don't exist anymore. That's our own history right there, not even 150 years ago. How many of you realize that the Republican Party was now the Democrat Party, and the Democrat Party is now the Republican Party? They switched sides over a period of time. In fact, if you go back to Abraham Lincoln, he would have been considered a Democrat now. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, they slowly began to switch values. So the point is that whatever jersey you want to put on, we're not even be able to put on the American jersey, really. We're not even supposed to put that on as our first allegiance. Peter wrote that we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, prepared for a special purpose, to proclaim the goodness of the one who drafted us on his team. And the way we play the game is not by arguing others into agreement or into submission, but by conducting ourselves in a way that even when they do talk trash about us, and they will, but even when they do, as they say in sport, they can't deny that we have game, because we have let our conduct overrule our words. And by doing that, it leads them, according to Peter, not to sing our praises, but to sing God's praises. In other words, in staying with the metaphor, when we do the things we're supposed to do, it makes the coach look like a genius. Right? And that's exactly what Peter's saying. And the very first way Peter tells us that we can do that is by how we show respect to whatever or government authority or whoever is in a place of authority, or anyone he or she has put in a place underneath them. Does that mean we agree with their politics? No, absolutely not. Does that mean that we think they have the highest character? Of course not. I very highly doubt that Peter, a Jewish man, agreed with the political ideals or the character of Caesar, especially considering that Caesar would eventually execute him. Peter, the one who walks with Jesus, goes on to say that God's will for us was to make such convincing arguments for our political opinion that we would silence the other side. Oh wait, that's not it, was it? He said God's will for us is that we live honorable lives such that by our actions we would silence those who criticize. Not by our words, not by arguing with them. And that interaction includes how we converse with those whose political opinions differ from ours. Another guy named Paul, who would also eventually be executed by Caesar, told his own apprentice Timothy, who was pastoring a church in Ephesus at the time, to command his congregation to pray for all kings and others in authority so that they could lead peaceful lives with dignity and because it pleases God. Later, in another letter to Timothy, he warns him, don't get involved in foolish, ignorant arguments that only start or propel fights. A servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but must be kind to everyone. As a result, he says, God may perhaps even grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth. So where does that leave us today? How do we respond to whatever happens on Tuesday or any other future election or any time after that? As I was putting the finishing touches on this message yesterday, I came across something that Andy Stanley said in an article that I think is pretty profound. He says, your candidate will win or lose on Tuesday depending on how America votes. But the church will win or lose based on how we Christians respond in the days to follow. So how can we best represent Christ in the church no matter what happens? Well, a few things. Number one, we accept the result as working within God's greater will. Let's let our view be macroscopic and not microscopic, knowing that God may be doing something in the bigger picture that we have no idea what it is. Secondly, we pray for those in leadership positions. Pray most particularly that God will move in their heart to do godly things. Their hearts are a stream of water like anyone else's. So pray that God will move that stream toward godly decisions. Third, we listen to those who think differently than we do. Seek to understand their experiences that led them to a different outlook. Don't try to argue with them into submission or agreement. Let's be a part of the solution and not part of the problem. Fourth, manage our expectations. Politicians, no matter what they promise, cannot cure the human condition, no matter what side of the aisle they're on. You can't legislate things like pride or greed or racism. You can't force people into making biblically moral choices. That doesn't change their life. And ultimately, that's the goal. And fifth, give thanks to God for whatever He is doing. If the current reality or the result don't even look like it or feel like it. Remember, God's ultimate purpose isn't about a political party or a platform or a candidate or even about the pet policies which you and I are very passionate about. It's about the opportunity and the impact that the church can have as a whole on those whose hearts are far from God. And ultimately, it's about bringing us closer and closer to the appointed time when his kingdom will reign on earth and all this chaos will go away. Let's pray.